From New York, this is Democracy Now!
In my view, the $348 billion in new money that is included in the proposal now being discussed is totally inadequate given the nature of the unprecedented crises that we face.
The House could be voting as soon as today on a new $900 billion coronavirus aid package that includes $600 stimulus checks and expanded unemployment benefits. We'll hear from Senator Bernie Sanders on why working families devastated by the pandemic need far more help. Then we look at President-elect Joe Biden's climate change team.
Together, this team will ensure that environmental justice and human impacts are top of mind as we tackle these tough issues.
The incoming Biden administration's vowing to address environmental justice and to listen to the science as it confronts the climate emergency. We'll hear from members of the team, including Interior Secretary nominee Deb Haaland, who's poised to become the first Native American to hold a cabinet position in U.S. history.
I'm proud to stand here on the ancestral homelands of the Lenape tribal nation. The President-elect and Vice President-elect are committed to a diverse cabinet, and I'm honored and humbled to accept their nomination for Secretary of the Interior.
Plus, we speak to former EPA official Mustafa Ali, who resigned in 2017 to protest the Trump administration's policies. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Lawmakers reached a deal Sunday on a $900 billion coronavirus relief package after months of stalled negotiations and just days before vital benefits were set to expire for millions across the United States. The measure includes $600 direct payments for taxpayers earning under $75,000 a year. Qualifying parents will get another $600 per child. Undocumented immigrants will not receive benefits, but their spouses may qualify. The legislation also includes enhanced federal unemployment benefits, aid for small businesses, schools, and childcare, and money for vaccine distribution. The bill also extends by 1 month the moratorium on evictions and $25 billion in emergency assistance to renters. The stimulus does not include state and local aid, which the Democrats have been fighting for, or corporate liability protections, which Republicans had demanded. Congress is expected to vote on the measure today. The White House said Sunday President Trump plans to sign the deal. The first shots of the Moderna vaccine are expected to be injected today as millions of doses of the second COVID-19 vaccine approved in the U.S. started rolling out to more than 3,700 locations Sunday. The Food and Drug Administration issued an emergency use authorization for the vaccine Friday for people 18 and over. A Centers for Disease Control and Prevention advisory panel said Sunday frontline essential workers, including teachers, grocery store workers, daycare staff, police, and firefighters, and those over 75 should be the next in line to receive the vaccination after the first wave of frontline health workers and nursing home residents. This all comes as the U.S. recorded over 250,000 cases. That's 250,000 cases in a day for the first time Friday. Nearly 1 in 200 people in the U.S. was diagnosed with COVID-19 in the last week, though the actual number of infected people is likely much higher. In Tennessee, which now has the highest number of new cases relative to its population, nearly 1 of every 100 residents tested positive within the last week. Republican Governor Bill Lee is still refusing to issue a mask mandate. In Los Angeles, hospitals are making plans for rationing care if the surge continues apace in the coming weeks. Canada, Russia, and India have joined a growing list of countries that are banning UK travel after British health officials warned a new, highly infectious variant of the coronavirus is sweeping Britain and is, quote, out of control. London and the southeast of England have gone into a strict lockdown. British officials claim the new variant could be 70% more contagious, but is not thought to be more deadly. Many scientists are skeptical of the claim, which has not been peer-reviewed, and researchers say there's no evidence the mutation will impact the effectiveness of COVID-19 vaccines. President-elect Joe Biden formally introduced the team he says is charged with tackling the existential threat of the climate crisis. This is Brenda Mallory, who's been tapped to run the Council on Environmental Quality.
CEQ will work with a broad range of partners on a broad range of issues, tackle the full breadth of climate change, preserve the natural treasures of our nation, center environmental justice, and help more communities overcome legacy environmental impacts.
We'll have more on this later in the broadcast. President Trump's reportedly mulling increasingly desperate ways to overturn the results of the 2020 election. In a heated Oval Office meeting Friday that included recently pardoned former National Security Advisor Michael Flynn and his attorney Sidney Powell, Trump considered appointing Powell, who promoted conspiracy theories about rigged voting machines, as special counsel to investigate alleged voter fraud. Powell had been ousted from the Trump campaign legal team over her outrageous remarks. Trump also reportedly discussed invoking martial law, which Flynn had suggested earlier in the week. Sidney Powell was seen back at the White House Sunday night. In related news, the Trump campaign is asking the Supreme Court to overrule Pennsylvania judges and throw out over 100,000 mail-in ballots in yet another last-ditch attempt to overturn his defeat. In other voting news, a federal judge Friday rejected a request by Georgia's two Republican senators, Kelly Loeffler and David Perdue, to prevent new Georgia residents from voting in the January 5th runoff election if they voted in another state in November. In Iraq, at least one person was injured Sunday as attackers fired a volley of rockets at the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad's heavily fortified Green Zone. The embassy said an anti-missile system intercepted the rockets mid-flight, preventing more damage. The attack came ahead of the first anniversary of President Trump's assassination of Iranian General Qasem Soleimani, who was killed in a U.S. drone strike near Baghdad International Airport January 3rd. In Afghanistan, a car bomb exploded in the capital Kabul Sunday, killing 9 people, wounding 15 others, including a parliamentarian. The blast followed a bombing at a religious gathering in Afghanistan's Ghazni province on Friday that left 15 people dead and 20 injured, with children among the victims. The attacks came just days after the top U.S. general, Joint Chiefs Chairman Mike Milley held unannounced talks with Taliban peace negotiators in Qatar. In India, over 24 people have died since mass protests began last month against Prime Minister Narendra Modi's move to deregulate agricultural markets. Officials say around half the deaths have been caused by the harsh winter, as tens of thousands of farmers are camping out in the cold or on the outskirts of New Delhi. A state of natural disaster has been declared in Fiji after Cyclone Yasa flattened entire villages and killed at least 4 people, including a 3-month-old baby. Prime Minister Frank Bainimarama sounded the alarm over the increasing frequency and strength of cyclones in Fiji. He said, "This is not normal. This is a climate emergency." Back in the United States, a new watchdog report finds New York police officers used excessive force and were unprepared to respond to racial justice protests that rose up this summer following the police killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis. Over 2,000 people were arrested at protests in May and June in New York as a stream of reports and videos of police violence circulated online. This is the New York City Department of Investigation Commissioner Margaret Garnett.
Tactics, which included encirclement, also known as kettling, mass arrests, baton and pepper spray use, and other tactics, reflected a failure to calibrate an appropriate balance between valid public safety or officer safety interests and the rights of protesters to assemble and to express their views.
In related news, a Boston police sergeant has been put on leave as an investigation is carried out into abuses during Black Lives Matter protests in Boston. The media outlet The Appeal last week published a report and body cam footage showing police officers used excessive force on demonstrators, including liberal use of pepper spray, and boasted about attacking protesters. A warning to our viewers, this story contains highly disturbing images. In Georgia, new body cam footage from the minutes after 3 white men murdered Ahmaud Arbery while he was out jogging show Arbery was still alive when police arrived at the scene. But officers did not immediately help him. They also declined to cuff Travis McMichael, even though he admitted to shooting Arbery. Lee Merritt, a lawyer for Arbery's family, said of the recently released videos, quote, "There has not been a black murder suspect in history who got the deference that these men received." Seattle police raided and cleared an encampment of unhoused people at a public park Friday and arrested over 20 people. Residents of the camp were given just 15 minutes to gather their belongings. Police also used rubber bullets to disperse protesters at the site. Community organizer and attorney Nikita Oliver tweeted, quote, "Sweeping Cal Anderson Park in winter during a pandemic is inhumane. Why not actually offer people food, supports, and services, rental assistance, places to live? Mayor Jenny, do better. Residents without homes are still humans and still residents," she tweeted. She was referring to the mayor, Jenny Durkin. The CDC has advised cities to leave encampments in place during the pandemic if they're not able to help rehouse people in safe places. In Arizona, members of the San Carlos Apache Nation have called a day of action today in opposition to a proposed copper mine in a sacred portion of the Tonto National Forest. The tribe says the planned mine would raze an ancient forest known as Oak Flat and contaminate a large swath of southern Arizona. The Trump administration's racing to approve the mine as part of a massive transfer of federal land to oil, gas, and mining companies in the final days of Trump's presidency. The plans include a proposed uranium mine in South Dakota, an open-pit lithium mine in Nevada, and a natural gas pipeline which would run through Virginia, West Virginia, and cross under the Appalachian Trail. We'll have more on this later in the broadcast. In cybersecurity news, a massive breach of U.S. government data continues to widen, with federal officials now saying the hack targeted the agency overseeing the U.S. nuclear weapons arsenal and 5 other government agencies. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said Friday it was clear that Russia was behind the hack. Just hours after he made the claim, President Trump broke his silence on the issue and said that China, not Russia, may have been responsible, while downplaying the scope of the hack. Trump tweeted, quote, "Everything is well under control," unquote. Trump's former top advisor on Homeland Security, Tom Bossert, told the New York Times it may take years to root out the effects of the hack and that, quote, "entire new networks need to be built." And the Supreme Court dismissed a lawsuit Friday challenging Trump's plan to exclude undocumented people from the final census count. The court said it was premature to rule on the case, which is, quote, "riddled with contingencies and speculation," unquote. Immigrant rights groups vowed to keep fighting against Trump's unconstitutional plan. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The House could be voting as soon as today on a new $900 billion coronavirus aid package after a deal was reached by congressional leaders Sunday. While the legislative text has not yet been released, the package is expected to include $600 relief checks for qualified adults and children and a temporary $300 increase in weekly unemployment benefits. The bill is expected to extend a CDC moratorium on evictions until January 31st. Many economists say a far larger stimulus package is needed to address the nation's economic crisis. Last week, 885,000 people filed new claims for unemployment benefits, the highest weekly level in 3 months. Meanwhile, a new study shows at least 8 million Americans have been pushed into poverty since summer. On Friday, Senator Bernie Sanders of Vermont spoke from the floor of the Senate and decried the aid deal as a, quote, "totally inadequate." He called for $1,200 emergency checks for every working-class adult and $500 per child.
This country faces the worst set of public health and economic crises that we have faced in over 100 years. As a result of the pandemic, more people are becoming infected than ever before. Right now, hospitalization is higher than it has ever been before right now. And more people are dying than ever before, literally day after day. Now, we all hope and pray that the new vaccine will be distributed as quickly as possible and that it will put an end to this nightmare. But today, the truth is that millions of low-income and middle-class families are suffering in a way that they have not suffered since the Great Depression of the 30s. Today, the reality is that over half of our workers are living paycheck to paycheck, trying to survive on a starvation wage of 10 or 12 bucks an hour. The reality is that millions of our senior citizens are trapped in their homes, unable to see their kids or their grandchildren, unable to go to a grocery store, and many of them are trying to get by on $12,000, $14,000 a year Social Security and scared that they may come down with the virus and die. In addition, millions more with disabilities are suffering. Further, in our country today, 1 out of 4 workers are either unemployed or make less than $20,000 a year. And in the midst of this pandemic, because we are the only major country on earth not to guarantee health care to all people as a right, in the midst of this pandemic, worst health care crisis in 100 years, over 90 million Americans are uninsured or underinsured and unable to go to a doctor when they need to. Further, we have the worst eviction crisis in modern history. Some 30 million families worried that because they cannot pay their rent, they may end up out on the street. That is, Mr. President, where we are today economically. And if this country means anything, if democracy means anything, if the U.S. government means anything, it means that we cannot turn our backs on this suffering. Not in Vermont, not in Wisconsin, not in New York, not in any state in this country where people are hurting in an unprecedented way. Mr. President, members of Congress should also be aware that we are far behind other major countries in terms of protecting working families during this pandemic. Not only does every other wealthy country guarantee health care to all people as a human right, almost all of them are providing far more generous benefits to the unemployed and the struggling in their countries than we are doing in our country. Mr. President, Madam President, several months ago, I introduced legislation along with Senator Kamala Harris, now our Vice President-elect, and Senator Markey, that would, during the course of this economic crisis, provide $2,000 a month, $2,000 a month to every working-class person in this country. And frankly, that is exactly what we should be doing. But unfortunately, given the conservative nature of the Senate, I understand that is not going to happen. Yet, at a time of massive income and wealth inequality, as Senator Schumer just indicated, at a time when huge corporations were making record-breaking profits, the Republican leadership here in the Senate was able to provide over $1 trillion in tax breaks to the 1% and large corporations. Yes, at a time when climate change, yes, climate change is real, at a time when climate change threatens the entire planet, this Congress was able to provide hundreds of billions of dollars in corporate welfare to the oil companies and the gas companies and the coal companies who are exacerbating the climate crisis. Yes, just the other day, here in the Senate and in the House, legislation was passed which would provide $740 billion to the military, the largest military budget in history, more than the next 10 nations combined. We spend more on the military than the next 10 nations combined. So we could do all of those things. Tax breaks for billionaires, massive corporate welfare, huge military expenditures. But in the midst of the worst economic meltdown since the Great Depression, somehow Congress is unable to respond effectively to the needs of working families. Madam President, as a result of the pandemic, the government told restaurants and bars, retail stores, movie theaters, schools, malls, small businesses all over this country, shut your doors. It is too dangerous for you to be open now. And they did that because that is what the public health experts said was the right thing to do in order to control this horrific pandemic. But what the government has not done, Madam President, is to provide the workers who lost their jobs and lost their incomes as a result of those shutdowns with the help that they need in order to pay their bills and to survive economically. The $600 a week in supplemental unemployment benefits that Congress passed unanimously in March expired in July, over 5 months ago. And during that time, the Republican Senate has done nothing to help working families pay their rent, feed their children, go to a doctor, or pay for the life-saving prescription drugs they need. And the Senate has not done anywhere near enough to provide help for the struggling small businesses in Vermont and all across this country who are desperately trying to stay afloat. Further, Madam President, as bad as the economy has been in general, it has been far worse for African Americans and Latinos. During the pandemic, nearly 60% of Latino families and 55% of African American families have either experienced a job loss or a cut in pay. Madam President, for 9 months, we have asked tens of millions of working people in this country to survive on one $1,200 check, with no help for health care, no support for hazard pay, no assistance for rent relief. Absolutely nothing. Meanwhile, Madam President, I should mention that over this same 9-month period, 651 billionaires in the United States became over $1 trillion richer. $1 trillion in increased wealth for the very richest people in our country. One $1,200 check for tens of millions of Americans desperately trying to survive. That is unconscionable, that is immoral, and that has got to change. Madam President, in my view, the $348 billion in new money that is included in the proposal now being discussed is totally inadequate given the nature of the unprecedented crises that we face. The American people cannot wait any longer. They need economic relief. Right now, their kids are going hungry. They are being evicted from their homes. They can't go to the doctor. They need help, and they need it now. Every working class American needs $1,200 at least, $2,400 for couples, and $500 for children. And let me be clear to emphasize a point that Senator Schumer made, and that is what I am talking about now is money that must not be taken from other important priorities like 16 weeks of supplemental unemployment benefits, aid for small business, nutrition, housing, education, and the other important provisions in this bill. We need adequate funding to address the unprecedented crises that we face. We should not and cannot and must not take from Peter to pay Paul. We cannot cut on unemployment benefits in order to help small business. We have got to do it all right now.
Senator Bernie Sanders speaking Friday on the floor of the House. He wore his mask throughout his speech. Next up, we look at President-elect Joe Biden's climate crisis team, which he announced Saturday.
Look around you, what do you see? Children going hungry, pain and misery.
Seeds by Georgia Ann Muldrow. This is Democracy Now!, the Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Under pressure from progressives and communities of color, President-elect Joe Biden vowed Saturday to make environmental justice and science top concerns as he selects his climate team. Speaking at an event in Wilmington, Delaware, Biden introduced Michael Regan, head of North Carolina's Department of Environmental Quality, as his choice to lead the Environmental Protection Agency. Regan will be the first black man to direct the EPA, where he served in several roles during the Clinton and George W. Bush administrations, including as National Program Manager for the agency's Office of Air Quality Planning and Standards. Regan's selection comes after weeks of speculation Biden would instead tap Mary Nichols, head of the California Air Resources Board, who fought the Trump administration's attempt to roll back pollution protections. But more than 70 environmental justice groups wrote to Biden earlier this month to oppose her nomination, saying she has a, quote, bleak track record in addressing environmental racism. Nichols was instead tapped to head a new White House Office of Climate Policy. This is Michael Regan accepting Biden's nomination to lead the EPA.
Growing up as a child, hunting and fishing with my father and grandfather in eastern North Carolina, I developed a deep love and respect for the outdoors and our natural resources. But I also experienced respiratory issues that required me to use an inhaler on days when pollutants and allergens were especially bad. I've always been curious about the connections between our environment and our health, how the world around us contributes to or detracts from our enjoyment of life. So after completing my education in environmental science, there was one place in particular that I wanted to work: the EPA. When I started that first summer internship, I never imagined that one day I would be nominated to lead an agency as its administrator. So this opportunity, well, it's a dream come true. Since the start of my career, my goals have been the same: to safeguard our natural resources, to improve the quality of our air and our water, to protect our families and our communities, and to help them seize the opportunities of a cleaner, healthier world. Now, I'm honored to pursue those goals alongside leaders who understand what's at stake. When President-elect Biden called out the plight of the fence-line communities during the campaign, he made it clear that we would no longer just deal with the issues up to the fence line of these facilities, but that we would actually see the people on the other side of those fence lines. He's already backed up that commitment by assembling a team that reflects America. And I'm proud to join the Vice President-elect as a fellow HBCU graduate in this administration. Together, this team will ensure that environmental justice and human impacts are top of mind as we tackle these tough issues. After nearly a decade at the EPA, I know firsthand the remarkable dedication and talent of those career staff. And as a state official, I understand how actions from EPA can help or hurt local efforts. We're going to ensure that EPA is once again a strong partner for the states, not a roadblock. We will be driven by our convictions that every person in our great country has the right to clean air, clean water, and a healthier life, no matter how much money they have in their pockets, the color of their skin, or the community that they live in.
That's Michael Regan, President-elect Biden's pick to head the Environmental Protection Agency. He'll get to work closely with Democratic Congresswoman Deb Haaland of New Mexico, who Biden has tapped to lead the Interior Department if they are both confirmed. Well, Deb Haaland is the first Native American cabinet secretary in history, if in fact the Senate confirms her. She's a member of the Pueblo of Laguna, co-sponsor of the Green New Deal, who participated in protests against the Dakota Access Pipeline at Standing Rock in 2016. The Congresswoman would take over the stewardship of about 1/5 of federal lands from the current Interior Secretary, David Bernhardt, a former energy industry lobbyist. This is Congressmember Haaland accepting Biden's nomination for Secretary of Interior Saturday.
I'm proud to stand here on the ancestral homelands of the Lenape tribal nation. The President-elect and Vice President-elect are committed to a diverse cabinet, and I'm honored and humbled to accept their nomination for Secretary of the Interior. Growing up in my mother's Pueblo household made me fierce. My life has not been easy. I struggled with homelessness. I relied on food stamps and raised my child as a single mom. These struggles give me perspectives, though, so that I can help people to succeed. My grandparents, who were taken away from their families as children and sent to boarding school in an effort to destroy their traditions and identities, maintained our culture. This moment is profound when we consider the fact that a former Secretary of the Interior once proclaimed his goal to, quote, civilize or exterminate us. I'm a living testament to the failure of that horrific ideology. I also stand on the shoulders of my ancestors and all the people who have sacrificed so that I can be here. My dad was a U.S. Marine, and no matter where we were stationed, he made sure we spent time outdoors. Time with my dad in the mountains or on the beach, and time with my grandparents in the cornfield at Laguna taught me to respect the earth and to value our resources. I carry those values with me everywhere. I'm a product of their resilience. As our country faces the impacts of climate change and environmental injustice, the Interior Department has a role to address these challenges. The President-elect's goals, driven by justice and empowering communities who have shouldered the burdens of environmental negligence. And we will ensure that the decisions at Interior will once again be driven by science. We know that climate change can only be solved with participation of every department and of every community. Coming together in a common purpose, this country can and will tackle this challenge. The President-elect and Vice President-elect know that issues under Interior's jurisdiction aren't simply about conservation. They're woven in with justice, good jobs, and closing the racial wealth and health gaps. This historic moment will not go by without the acknowledgement of the many people who have believed in me over the years and had the confidence in me for this position. I'll be fierce for all of us, for our planet and all of our protected land, and I'm honored and ready to serve. Thank you again.
That's New Mexico Congressmember Deb Haaland, Biden's pick to head the Interior Department. She would be the first Native American cabinet member in history, if approved. Meanwhile, longtime environmental attorney Brenda Mallory will chair Biden's Council on Environmental Quality. This is Mallory accepting the position.
I am honored and humbled by the trust you've placed in me, and I look forward to getting to work with this incredible team. I know firsthand the challenges that everyday people face when one unexpected illness or expense can upend the economic stability of a family. I grew up in the working class community of Waterbury, Connecticut, a town not so different from Scranton, Pennsylvania. I know the faces of the marginalized, and I appreciate the challenges of urban pollution. While the words climate change and environmental injustice were not part of the vernacular back then, the evidence of their impacts was all around. In that setting, there was plenty of opportunity to work to make a difference in people's lives. For my parents, and particularly my father, dedication to tackling community challenges was vitally important. Service in all its forms was essential. They taught me to be a problem solver, to recognize that each of us is blessed with different talents, and we are all called to bring those gifts to bear in wherever we are, to work with anyone and everyone to make things better in communities that we share. This has been the driving force and the guiding principle of my journey. I earned a high school scholarship that changed the course of my life. I became the first person in my family to go to college. I attended law school. And at each stage, I was aware of how different the world I came from was from the one I was entering. I didn't set out to specialize in environmental issues, but once I started, I was always mindful of the practical implications of the decisions. As a staffer at the Connecticut Commission on Human Rights, I learned that environmental protection and ensuring the health and well-being of all communities had to be reconciled. It is essential that we deploy smart and humane policy to help communities pull themselves back from the edge and improve the health, security, and prosperity of all people. The Build Back Better plan is poised to breathe new life into the Council on Environmental Quality. CEQ will work with a broad range of partners on a broad range of issues, tackle the full breadth of climate change, preserve the natural treasures of our nation, center environmental justice, and help more communities overcome legacy environmental impacts. I am grateful to the President-elect and Vice President-elect for elevating this work and lifting up the communities where it will make the most difference.
That's longtime environmental attorney Brenda Mallory. If confirmed, she will chair Biden's Council on Environmental Quality. This is Gina McCarthy, who served as head of the EPA under President Obama. She'll now head up a new White House Office of Climate Policy.
All I can think of is back when I was in grammar school and the nuns used to jump up and say, run, close the windows in your classrooms, because when the rubber factory across the street started to spew chemical stenches into the air, it would come wafting into our classroom. And that smell kept us from recess more days than I or my teacher ever cared to remember. So I figured out early that there was just an intrinsic connection between our environment and our health. And that understanding drew me into a very long career of public service, which I will never regret and always cherish. And I did it because I was trying to help families and communities just like mine, and those who are facing certainly much steeper and more insidious legacies of environmental harm, so they could overcome the challenges that were holding them back. Environmental protection is part of my moral fiber. It's what I live for. And I'm proud of the progress that we've made across the United States, and I'm proud of the work that I did for many years at local and state governments, as well as at EPA, to make sure our air and water were cleaner. to make communities safer and more livable, and begin to confront the crisis of climate change. And I'm here today because climate change is not only a threat to the planet, it is a threat to our health and our well-being. It's a threat to people everywhere and the precious natural resources that we depend on. Defeating this threat is the fight of our lifetimes.
That's Gina McCarthy, who will serve as head of a new White House Office of Climate Policy. Her deputy national climate advisor will be Pakistani-American Ali Zaidi, who's currently the Deputy Secretary for Energy and Environment for the state of New York.
I am deeply honored to answer your call to serve this nation that I love, especially at this moment of consequence. For our planet and for the people who live here, the peril of the climate crisis is already evident. But we can also see the promise in the jobs, casting and machining, installing and rewiring, pouring new foundations, and building new industries. And in the possibility of repairing communities hurt, places where pollution has been heavy and opportunity has never quite reached. Mr. President-elect and Madam Vice President-elect, you campaigned on delivering that promise by mounting a response equal to the existential threat that we face, not only by listening to the science, but also by invigorating the economy, revving up manufacturing and innovation, spurring good-paying union jobs, and advancing justice long overdue, leading by the example of America at its best. When my parents moved from Pakistan to Pennsylvania, they brought 2 little kids and a few suitcases of dreams. Dreams their kids are living today. Danish, my brother, a doctor on the front lines of the COVID crisis, and me, moving to the front lines of the fight against climate change. To be healthy, to have purpose, to be able to give back. That is how our parents taught us to define the American dream.
That's Biden's incoming Deputy National Climate Advisor, Ali Zaidi. In another major move announced Saturday, President-elect Biden said his climate team will include former Michigan Governor Jennifer Granholm, who he's nominated to be Energy Secretary. If confirmed, she'll play a key role in helping to fulfill Biden's pledge to move the United States off fossil fuel.
My commitment to clean energy was forged in the fire. I was the governor of Michigan, as the president-elect said, during the Great Recession, when it struck and pushed our auto industry, which is the lifeblood of Michigan, to the brink of utter collapse. Workers were losing their jobs through no fault of their own. Banks wouldn't lend. People were losing their houses. Our unemployment rate in Michigan was 15%. In Detroit, it was 28%. But then, thankfully, as now, help was on the way. Joe Biden and the Obama administration worked with us to rescue the auto industry and the 1 million jobs that are attached to it. They worked with us to retool and electrify Detroit for the future, of course, and to diversify Michigan's economy on the premise of this promising future in clean energy. So today, in the midst of another harrowing crisis, clean energy remains among the most promising jobs and economic growth sector in the world. Over the next 2 decades, countries and companies are going to invest trillions, not just billions, trillions, in electric cars and batteries
batteries and wind turbines and solar panels and energy-efficient appliances and energy-efficient buildings. They're going to upgrade their electric grids using smart technology. Millions of good-paying jobs are going to be created. Millions. But where? Where will those jobs be? Are they going to be in China or in the other countries that are fighting tooth and nail to corner the market on this hopeful electric and clean energy future? Or are those jobs going to be here in America? The path to building back better starts with building and manufacturing and deploying those products here, stamping them made in America and exporting them around the world. We can win those jobs for American workers with the right policy. We can.
That's Energy Secretary nominee Jennifer Granholm, who then talked about why jobs were so important to her by talking about her family's history.
My dad was born in rural Canada in a log cabin with no running water into extreme poverty. His father, my grandfather, emigrated to Canada from Sweden during the Great Depression, again, seeking opportunity. But when my grandfather could not find a job to support his young family, in desperation, my grandfather shot himself, leaving my grandmother and 3 young children in dire poverty. My father was 3 years old when that happened. And when he was 11, my dad found work at a sawmill, and he never stopped working. He married my mom. They came to America for work. And despite not having a college degree, my hardworking, gentle father got the fair chance that he was looking for in America. He had started out as a bank teller, and he retired as head of the bank. And it's because of my family's journey and my experience in fighting for hardworking Michigan families that I have become obsessed with creating good-paying jobs in America.
That's former Michigan Governor Jennifer Granholm, who President-elect Biden has tapped as his incoming energy secretary. When we come back, we'll speak to former EPA official Mustafa Santiago Ali. He resigned in 2017 from the EPA to protest Trump administration policies. Stay with us. By Purifé. This is Democracy Now!, the Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We get a response now to President-elect Joe Biden's announcement Saturday of the members of his climate team who will tackle what he called the, quote, existential threat of the climate crisis. His picks include Democratic Congresswoman Deb Haaland of New Mexico to lead the Interior Department, Banker, the first Native American cabinet secretary in history, if confirmed, and Michael Regan, head of North Carolina's Department of Environmental Quality, who would be the first black man to lead the Environmental Protection Agency. Biden also picked longtime environmental attorney Brenda Mallory to chair Biden's Council on Environmental Quality. Gina McCarthy, head of the EPA under Obama, will lead a new White House Office of Climate Policy, and former Michigan Governor Jennifer Granholm to be Energy Secretary. Last month, Biden named former Secretary of State John Kerry as international presidential envoy on climate change. For more, we go to Washington, D.C. to speak with Mustafa Santiago Ali, former head of the Environmental Justice Program at the Environmental Protection Agency. In 2017, he resigned in protest of the Trump administration's efforts to severely scale back the size and work of the EPA. He first helped launch the EPA's Office of Environmental Justice in 1992 and served under both Republican and Democratic administrations. He's now vice president of the National Wildlife Federation. Mustafa, welcome back to Democracy Now! It's great to have you with us. As we watched and listened to in our last segment, people standing up one by one, talking about the climate crisis and specifically referring to the issue of environmental justice, we see the power of movements. People chosen that President-elect Biden hadn't planned to originally choose, like the head of the EPA, going with Michael Regan, coming from heading up the Environmental Agency in North Carolina. Can you talk about those movements and what they have accomplished?
Well, I think it's a transformational set of movements that are actually happening. For us to see individuals saying the words and being tied to environmental justice, understanding the impacts of climate change is something that we've never seen before. And it also speaks to all the hard, incredible work that environmental justice leaders across the country have been doing to ensure that our president-elect is giving serious thought to vulnerable communities, to the impacts that are happening from the climate crisis, and really working through with his team and making these decisions, not snap decisions, but actually deep thought going into the individuals and also hearing and listening to the voices of communities.
So can you talk about Michael Regan heading up the Environmental Protection Agency, if he's confirmed? And, of course, you've known him for many, many years. He once interned at the EPA, as he said, will be the first black man to head up the agency. If you can talk about the original reported pick of President-elect Biden being Mary Nichols from California, and what happened, the movement that said she did not deal with climate justice in the way that environmental justice movements felt needed to be represented as at head of the EPA.
Yeah. Well, let me start out by saying that environmental justice is now our North Star for our country, and the president has made significant commitments there that environmental justice is one of his priority areas. So therefore, it has to be a part of the evaluation and a set of criteria, when you're choosing individuals. Mary has been an expert and a champion on, clean air related actions. So we want to make sure that we honor that. But you also have to make sure that you're honoring the voices of communities as you're moving in the development of policies and regulations and a set of actions. And a number of stakeholders from California and then across the country called out the fact that they felt that, that Mary had not honored that she had not fully listened to their voices and included them in the processes that were happening there in California. And that became, a drag, I think, on her being nominated as the Environmental Protection Agency's administrator. Then you transition to Michael. I've known him since he was a student. He, as you heard, as the listeners heard earlier, has a real tie to the land, has a tie to communities, and has been a strong regulator on environmental impacts, also understanding how the climate crisis is playing out, and the fact that we also have to be focused when you can to also be focused on a clean economy. So he has a number of challenges that are in front of him, but being there in North Carolina, he had a Democratic governor, but he had a Republican set of lawmakers who were, continually trying to slow down the process. He did some great work around coal ash. There are others probably who wish there was even more in that space, but, he pushed Duke Energy to address some of those issues. And he also worked on PFOA and PFOS issues and began to make some progress in that area. You know, he's going to just have to be surrounded by a number of folks who will help him to achieve the goals that the president is going to set out. He's going to need those who have environmental justice competencies and also experience, because the set of challenges are huge, but the set of opportunities are even larger. I think Michael is up to the task, and folks will hold him accountable.
Also, to have Deb Haaland, if approved, to be the Interior Secretary, the first Native American in history to be named to the cabinet. Your response?
Oh, Congresswoman Haaland has my heart. She is a true progressive. She is someone who is anchored in culture, anchored in the changes that can and will happen inside of our country. I've been blessed to do a number of events with Deb, and she's the real deal. So, you know, the beauty of the diversity of this administration is not just in the color of people's skins, but also their commitment to folks back home and folks across our country. So I think it was an excellent selection in having Congresswoman Deb Haaland to lead the Department of Interior.
So you have a number of people overall in the Biden-elect administration who come from the time of Obama. And I guess the question is, how do you ensure that the movements that, for example, you're a part of are going to continue to be heard? I think of the first African-American who was named head of the EPA. That was Lisa Jackson. And she ultimately quit under President Obama because she felt undermined and didn't have support, not by the Republicans, yes, of course, who were opposing her, but by the Democrats and the Obama administration when she tried to propose tougher regulations on smog pollution that she had negotiated for over a year. And she felt undercut when the president, at that time Obama, did not support her. How do you avoid a situation like this?
Well, Amy, that's what I appreciate about Democracy Now! Is that it's all about real talk. And we have to understand that we have power in this process. And that's why I've often said it doesn't matter if it's a Democrat, a Republican, or an independent who's leading, that we have to stay engaged in the process. We have to push and we have to hold people accountable. The reality of the situation is that 2022 is not that far away, and 2024 is not that far away. So folks are going to have to listen to the voices of communities, progressive voices, moderate voices, and others, if they want to be able to win on these issues. And that means also that there are a number of other positions that are going to be filled, and that those individuals who are coming from other parts of the party have to fill some of those positions to make sure this moves forward.
Mustafa, let me ask you very quickly about what's happening today in Arizona. Members of the San Carlos Apache Nation have called a day of action in opposition to a proposed copper mine in a sacred portion of the Tonto National Forest. The tribe saying the planned mine would raze an ancient forest known as Oak Flat and contaminate a large swath of southern Arizona. The Trump administration racing to approve the mine as part of a massive transfer of federal land to oil, gas, and mining companies in the final days of the Trump's presidency. What about these final days and what Trump is attempting to do?
We have to stay focused. They have continued to impact, our federal lands just so folks can do additional mining. These are traditional lands. There is a cultural connection there. People have to continue to engage, to fight back. Folks have been also going through legal challenges on many of these actions. We just have to continue to put a spotlight on it. And when the new administration comes in, they're going to have to use every tool that they have to reverse many of these decisions that will have long-term historical impacts in vulnerable communities across our country.
Mustafa Ali, I want to thank you so much for being with us. Former longtime head of the Environmental Justice Program at the Environmental Protection Agency, now Vice President of the National Wildlife Federation. Thank you so much for joining us today. Democracy Now! Produced with Renee Feltz, Mike Burke, Dina Guster, Libby Renee, Nermeen Sheikh, Maria Terracena. I'm Amy Goodman. Wear a mask.